Welcome to Will You Still Need Me? Will You Still Feed Me When I'm 64? We are going to talk about elder abuse today, and from more of a social perspective rather than a legal perspective, to give you some insights and some helpful advice or tips as you address cases involving elder abuse. When we talk about family violence, the majority of people either think of child abuse or intimate partner violence. You can see that very rarely does the thought of elder abuse come to mind, but it does happen with much more frequency than is reflected by these numbers. And why is that? Well, we'll get into a number of reasons, but we know that as people age, they become more vulnerable, more susceptible to abuse because of limitations that they experience. The most obvious, of course, are the physical, and as we were setting up for today's webinar, I noticed this old lady's image on my screen and thought, who is that woman? But of course, it's me. And the signs of aging are in our faces, essentially. They're visible. We moan and groan as we get up out of a chair or try to kneel down. And the cognitive indications of aging are also apparent as they occur. We notice aging people asking the same question repeatedly, or forgetting where they put their keys, or developing some paranoia because they've lost something that they really haven't lost, but they just don't remember where they put it. And the less visible is the emotional vulnerability that comes with aging, being depressed because of the limitations you're experiencing physically, but also the losses you're suffering with your loved ones. Your family members are passing, your friends are passing, they're moving in with younger relatives who will take care of them, and they're not as accessible as they used to be. So you might have heard in court about limitations on activities of daily living. I just want to make sure that you are aware of what is considered an activity of daily living and an instrumental activity of daily living. There is a distinction. So those are listed there. So what is elder abuse? We have a couple of definitions. This is one from the National Health Organization, the National Institute of Health, and then we have a different one from the World Health Organization. But essentially, it is a pattern of taking advantage of somebody's vulnerabilities within a relationship or not. The World Health Organization recognizes it within any relationship, and the National Institute of Health does not have that prerequisite. So there are multiple types of elder abuse. There are physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional abuse, financial or fiduciary abuse, and sexual abuse. I think we have a question at this point. Name 3 types of elder abuse. All right, so the majority of you got the correct answer, which is there is a physical, emotional, and fiduciary abuse. So neglect is one type of abuse, or one mistreatment, maltreatment of an aging person. Okay, abandonment is another form of maltreatment of an aging person or older adult. Abandonment is another form where somebody who is responsible for the care of the aging person is not meeting their responsibilities. So there's also exploitation, and we've heard about exploitation a lot. We know that banks report it, investment counselors report it, lawyers report it, accountants report it. So what is it? We know that it not only involves taking money from an aging person, but also applying their money to things that don't benefit them. Might not benefit the perpetrator, but it doesn't benefit the aging person, and therefore it falls within the category of exploitation. So some signs of financial abuse: no access to their accounts, where somebody else is accessing their bank accounts, allegedly paying their bills for them, but actually using their account, the elderly person's accounts, for the perpetrator's own benefit, or refusing money that the elder needs for caregivers, or refusing money for the caregiver's medication or other necessaries. Okay, and the perpetrators have explanations or excuses, however you want to look at it. They will tell you that it was a gift from the aging person. The aging person might not deny that. There would be a reason for that. Or the perpetrator will say, I'll pay it back. Or they say, in my culture, we all share each other's assets, and it's not unacceptable or it's not unusual for me to be using my grandfather's money to pay for my expenses. But lack of finances are a major deciding factor for an abused person's return to an abusive relationship. And so that is why the aging person might not acknowledge that they're being exploited. Culture is another reason why an aging person might not admit that they're being exploited, and they will return to the relationship. But financial dependence is a major reason for remaining in an abusive relationship or returning to one. So who are the victims of elder abuse? Well, we are now defining elders as 60 years or older, but it's anybody, male, female, transgender, all races, ethnic backgrounds, cultures, religions, sexual orientations, and in fact, those who identify with the LGBTQ community suffer abuse of a new kind. They have gained social acceptance and are out, and sometimes their family never accepts the lifestyle that they are living, and now the family finds themselves in a position to take advantage of their LGBTQ relative and to dominate and to demean them for the lifestyle that they found unacceptable, and therefore the poor elderly person is left to suffer the abuse of that relative. So common identifiers for risk of abuse. Understand, again, this is more of a social presentation than a legal presentation. We're not going to get into statutes or cases, but some statistics. Demographically, the primary victims of elder abuse are over 80 years old. They're female, non-Hispanic, of the Black race, and have a low income of maybe $15,000 or that vicinity. They have more than 3 medical conditions. They might have some mild cognitive impairment or some extreme cognitive impairment. They have depressive symptoms. They might have some physical disability or I guess just a weakness, a frailty about them, and they have a limited social network. So they have nobody to turn to when they feel that they're being victimized, and they are afraid to leave the situation that they're in because they're feeling so isolated. They continue to accept the abuse because they don't feel like they have a choice, really. So as judges, how do we identify that somebody is a victim of abuse? If we see that they are not taking care of themselves, or that they're depending on someone else to provide their care, and they are not presenting in a clean, appropriately dressed manner, if they're uncomfortable with the person who's providing their care, and you pick up on that, if they're having memory problems, and frankly, those memory problems are two-edged swords. They might not remember that they're being abused or that somebody took something from them. They also might believe that somebody has taken something just because they can't find it, or they don't know where it is. They might have a bank account at Wells Fargo for the last 10 years, and they suddenly decide that somebody's accessing it that shouldn't, and so they move it to Bank of America. And then the next time they go to the bank, they go to Wells Fargo, and they don't have an account there anymore. So it's a double-edged sword, the problems that come with memory loss. But certainly we need to have our radar up when we see somebody suffering from some cognitive impairment. Other clues: a hoarding situation, living in a home that doesn't have proper services like utilities or phone service, somebody who has just lost a loved one and again is feeling isolated and dependent on people that they're not really comfortable depending on and that probably they shouldn't be depending upon. We also have physical abuse, and I've talked a little bit about that already. Physical abuse of elderly people occurs everywhere, not just in nursing homes. We hear a lot about nursing home abuse, but actually most of it occurs in the community where the perpetrators are known to the aging person, sometimes being paid by the aging person, and certainly trusted by the aging person. And so who are the perpetrators? They can be spouses, and understand that, again, from a cultural standpoint, some ethnic groups or nationalities will insist on taking care of their loved one no matter how dependent that person becomes. The spouse doesn't want to place their beloved spouse in a nursing home, and they continue to provide care and overextend themselves and not only suffer self-neglect, but the person that they're taking care of is not receiving the care that they should receive, perhaps at the level of care that they need, perhaps because their caregiver doesn't have the patience to provide the care that they need or doesn't have the resources to provide the care that they need, but they insist on providing that care. It's inadvertent, but it is abuse. Paid and unpaid caregivers. Again, taking care of aging people can be a challenge and it takes special people to do that. And sometimes they don't have the best intentions, I guess, when they take those positions. People that are financially and emotionally or emotionally dependent upon the victim. So children of the victims who mean well, they maybe move in with the aging person and they intend to take care of the aging person, but suddenly they realize how easy it is to use the relationship they have with that aging person to their own personal advantages. Neighbors, best friends, sweethearts, lawyers, financial advisors, even the clergy have been known to take advantage of relationships with elderly people for financial reasons, for sexual reasons, and to dominate and make decisions for the aging person that the aging person would not accept otherwise, but for their dependence on their abuser. So again, looking for signs of that kind of abuse, physical abuse, the victim will often justify because they want to stay in that relationship for whatever reason. Most often it is financial, but sometimes it's romantic. They will say that they are clumsy. They will say that they started an altercation with the abuser. They will fail to cooperate or say that they bruise easily and, again, accept responsibility for the acts of the person abusing them. Also, caregiver stress. As I mentioned a minute ago, taking care of aging people has its own challenges. And the caregivers need to understand their own limitations as well as the stressors that come with taking care of an aging person. And they will say the aging person started an altercation, or they're too difficult to care for, or that they're doing all that they can. So if we could bring up the next question. The following are signs of financial abuse. A is the correct answer. The elder has no control over her own bank account. So we'll move on then. So is caregiver stress real? Again, the elder can be difficult. People with dementia can be frustrating, demanding. There's often a paranoid facet to their dementia, and it comes sometimes because they realize their limitations, and it frustrates them that they don't understand something or they're no longer able to do something that they've always been able to do. Also, they lose things and They hide things. If, again, the paranoia has progressed a little bit, and it just takes a little bit for them to think that they need to start hiding things, and it might not even be something of value. They just want to hide their comb because they think somebody's taking their comb, or more often money. And then when they can't find it, they blame the people closest to them. Or if the person who's taking care of them actually finds the item they're looking for, they will say, well, that's because that's where you put it when you took it from me. That can be frustrating. And if it's somebody that's not related to the aging person, they're worried about how that could affect them long term when they're being accused of wrongdoing. Elder care can go on for years as the person continues to deteriorate and transitions to needing more and more care. That can be frustrating. And also, the caregiver is wondering how much longer they can do it. And caregivers can suffer from depression as a result. They can compromise their own health. They might be supporting the aging person, and so they're distressed financially. And those feelings are real. So let's assess the caregiver. About 43.5 million caregivers provide unpaid care, so family members that are caring for their aging loved one. The majority of caregivers care for only one adult, but some have multiple adults to care for. It might be both of their parents, it might be a spouse or a disabled child who is now an adult, and their own parents. Could be any combination of people that they're providing care for. We have, I'm going to just say a blow up of Alzheimer's victims, meaning that as the population is aging, as the baby boomers have reached age 65 and older now, and as our population generally is aging, the chances of getting Alzheimer's or developing Alzheimer's increases, and that population is getting bigger and bigger. So now we have a huge caregiver population for those victims of Alzheimer's. And excuse me, almost 60% of caregivers report that they suffer from emotional stress from caregiving. It's high to very high in their households. 65% of those receiving care are age 69 and female. Age 69 or older and female, and 75% of the caregivers are female, and spend as much as 50% of their time providing care. 50% more of their time providing care than males provide as caregivers. And male caregivers are less likely to provide personal care. They might pay the aging relatives' bills, or oversee their investments, or take care of their lawn or house and other assets, but not the personal care of feeding, bathing, making sure they're getting their medications. Statistics might not apply in every household, but statistically, that's what we see. The more care is given, the more likely there is to be a spouse involved in the care. In other words, the person receiving the care is a spouse or partner. And caregivers experience things like guilt, that they're losing their respect, I guess, for the person who now needs their care. They feel badly about the way that they treated the relationship with the person who now needs care in the past. They're embarrassed about odd behavior. If anybody's familiar with the Alzheimer's Association, they actually have a business card that they give to people, to caregivers, so that, let's say you take your loved one who's suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia of any form, out to lunch, and they're abusive to the server, and they're maybe acting unusually. So this business card essentially says to the server, please excuse my friend's behavior. She or he is a victim of Alzheimer's disease, so that the server can be more patient and understanding and have some context for the behavior. They'll lose their temper, again, not understanding the limitations of the patient or the aging person. They are used to learning from that person, perhaps, if it's a parent, or if it's a spouse, that that person had always taken care of them and now they're having to do things that they're not accustomed to doing, not understanding how to do it, doing laundry and finding everything came out pink because we washed something, that was not color-proof, and everything else, ran onto everything else in that load of laundry. Or trying to cook dinner and burning, the main course, or not adding sugar instead of salt or something like that. And so losing temper over things that the caregiver doesn't understand or wasn't prepared for. Not wanting to take responsibility for caregiving. If there is a family of 6 or 7 children and all of the care of their parents is falling to 1 or 2 of those people, they become resentful of their siblings that they're not helping. And the care seems to be nonstop and they're not able to have any respite or even take a vacation or perhaps attend to their own needs. And so they become resentful or guilty, feeling guilty rather, for not devoting themselves entirely to their caregiving. And they might feel bad about the promises that they've made in the past. I'll never put you in a nursing home, or I'll never let anybody else take care of you. I'll always be the one that's there for you. And suddenly they're not able to do that, and they're providing as much care as they can. It's not enough, and they feel guilty about that. Caregivers also feel grief as they lose the relationship they once had with the person they're now caring for. They also see other peers of the person they're caring for passing away or moving away, and they lose those relationships. People who are caring for their partners, I'm sorry to read from the PowerPoint, but they're less likely to experience grief at the loss of the future, or they're also likely to grieve the loss of the future that they had planned or anticipated having with this person who now is dependent upon them and unable to have the life that they had been looking forward to. And of course, anger. It's natural to be frustrated in these situations because of all the demands that are being put on the caregiver, to be annoyed. They run into things that they never anticipated, and I'm trying to think of an example of that, but there are caregiving situations that arise that you don't anticipate, and you might become angry as a response to that because you're afraid of how to handle it. And it might also present financial hardship if you have to leave your job or cut back your hours in order to take care of the person who's now dependent upon you. We hear about the sandwich generation, which is people who are raising children. Typically, they're about in their teenage years and demanding more and more attention on their behavior from their parents, and yet that parent has to take care of their parents or perhaps their grandparents because they're the ones that are available or closest geographically to the person who needs care. So they don't have enough time for both their children and their patients, and they're exhausted and they're frustrated by being pulled from both directions. They feel like they have, is it Hobbes' choice to who are they going to give their attention to? Who is it today, or who is it this hour or this minute? And they have to make their resources meet the needs of both the children and the people that they're taking care of. And some caregivers who are expressing frustration or caregiver stress are no longer the head of the household because they're taking care of their parent who is actually dependent upon them but perceives themselves to be the parent in the relationship and have not been able to make that transition to being the patient and the person dependent. The caregiver might just assert themselves as the one who is the stronger in the relationship, or the younger, or the sharper, and feel entitled to be the one in control and not the patient whose needs are going to flex with their particular frame of mind at the time. at times when they feel they have lucid intervals, they will act out perhaps and resent the people who are taking care of them, or they might become very emotional and grateful for the care that they're receiving and then guilty for what they're putting the caregivers through, especially in that sandwich generation situation. And the caregiver who wants to be in control might exploit that emotion. So some of the problems that caregivers run into with the person that they're taking care of, I'll just go to clinging off the top of the list on the right, because they realize that they have limitations and are fearful that they will be left unattended or that their needs are not going to be made, or they don't realize that they are in need of help and have limitations and they wander off, perhaps to walk back to Michigan or wherever they moved to Florida from, thinking that it's not so far. And I'll just share an experience I had with my mother, who was a victim of Alzheimer's, and she was born and raised in Ireland and then came to the United States in search of the American dream. And when she was 80, I took her to Ireland to see her sister who had had surgery, and because of the Alzheimer's, my mother thought she was dying. And so when we were on the plane, we switched in New York. We flew from Orlando up to New York and then flew from New York to Dublin. And when we were in New York, she gave me a fit because she didn't understand why we couldn't just walk the rest of the way. She had no comprehension of the Atlantic Ocean or, the 3,000 miles we still had to go to get to Ireland. And not an unusual experience, unfortunately. So these are the other kinds of behavior that caregivers have to confront. Hallucinations, that's another one, again, goes along with the paranoia, and incontinence, and maybe being out publicly and not having the materials that they need to change the aging person. And of course, the aging person is embarrassed and might even be too modest to allow somebody else to change them. But if we assume that caregiver stress is responsible for abuse of an aging person, we fail to see that it's really the basis of it is power and control. So caregiver stress is not a primary cause of elder abuse. Abusive behaviors are intentional and coercive, and the perpetrators will come up with excuses. They will manipulate the situation to their own advantage. They will be charming and calm in public, but behind closed doors, they'll be taking out their frustration or their anger or their guilt for getting caught in an abusive act when they're behind closed doors with the elder or the victim. And they will also blame the victim when they're confronted with abusive behavior. And it's all about power and control, just like domestic violence and other forms of interpersonal abuse. Elder abuse is all about power and control, and we need to, as judges, recognize that so that we address that and not the other things that are going on, this Hobbes choice between the children and the aging person, or the other stressors that the caregiver is taking is under, I guess I should say. Also understand that in those polls or those reports that we see where caregiver stress is made to account for elder abuse, it's not the elder that's being interviewed for that information, it's the caregivers that are being interviewed for that information. So it's an unreliable outcome given that only one side of that relationship is being interviewed or asked about the abuse. We have seen perpetrators of elder abuse blame drinking, relationships that they had with the victim as children, that they were abused by the victim when they were children, or that they now have anger abuse or anger management issues, and that's why they're abusive. But at the heart of all this, we have to understand is the power and control element, and these other things might be going on, and they might give us a greater understanding of the situation, but the heart of it is the power and control issue. And perpetrators have a difficult time understanding that other people, in particular vulnerable people, are deserving of respect, and that they are not losing that entitlement to respect because they are losing their cognitive abilities or their physical abilities, or even becoming more emotional as they're aging. The perpetrators prey on their victims, again, recognizing the vulnerability of the victim and taking advantage of that, or they might take advantage of the strength of the victim, which is typically financial, by exploiting them financially, or by using their property as if it was the perpetrator's own property. Again, I mentioned earlier about a child moving in with a parent to take care of them, and then suddenly realizing how easy it is to use that situation to their own advantage. So they will not pay any rent or not contribute to the household, and the only income is whatever income the elderly person has, and that has to stretch for everybody's needs, and suddenly their needs become more important than the aging person's needs, and abuse occurs in that format. Some caregivers have co-occurring issues such as substance abuse, mental health, other medical conditions. The role of caregiver might just have dropped on them. They didn't seek it out, but they are the only ones that are available to provide the care needed. It might be geographic. It might be that that is the only person that the aging person will trust. We know about fracturing in families, and even if you have 12 children, you might not see any of them at Thanksgiving or Christmas because you don't get along with them, or they don't get along with each other and they refuse to come to your house if one of them or another is going to be there. And so the stress of that, I guess, that's not what I want to say. What I want to say is that the relationships that fracture like that also affect the abuse on the elder, or create situations where abuse can occur. Elder abuse is like intimate partner violence because it always, A, is perpetrated against family members or others in the household living like a family. B, originates with a desire to express power and control. C, can be criminally punished. Or D, occurs privately. All right. So B, originates with power and control. The majority of you answered, not quite the majority. The majority didn't answer, but the majority who did answer got the right answer. So how do we assist people who are victims of elder abuse from the bench? Do we intervene in ways that enable them to get to resources that provide them relief from the stress, or treat their substance abuse, or provide home health or housekeeping services? Understand that we can do that, but we still need to address the power and control issue. These things might ameliorate some of the stress on the individual perpetrating the abuse, but it's not going to eliminate the abuse. Oh, I'm going to forget to go back to my thumbnail. Okay. It's not going to eliminate the abuse if we don't address the power and control issue. All right, let's try again. If victim safety is not adequately addressed when the abuse is attributed to the caregiver stress, we also leave the victim in peril of continuing to be abused or exploited or neglected or even abandoned. We again need to address power and control. We can remove the victim from the situation, but they will go back if there is financial dependence. And if they go back, they will be victimized again, or could be victimized again, unless we address the power and control element. We don't want to unintentionally empower the abuser by addressing the stress and not the power and control issues, or addressing the substance abuse or the mental health or the fractured relationship with the person who's being victimized. We have to be mindful that the power and control element has to be addressed. Otherwise, the abuser remains unaccountable. And some of you might remember the Mickey Rooney story, where he was isolated and declared incapacitated, and none of the allegations of the incapacity proceeding really panned out. And when he got out from under the relatives who were taking advantage of him, he testified before Congress about his experience. So if you see elder abuse, certainly report it to the abuse hotline. You can do it either by phone or you can do it online. The website address is there. Excuse me, there's also a faxing option. Unfortunately, I don't have the fax number available for you, but that is also available online. So whenever you see it, as they say, see something, say something, and make a report of the abuse. So why do victims stay? I've already talked at length, I guess, about for financial reasons, also because they feel isolated if they, particularly the abuser isolates them intentionally and denies their loved ones access or their friends access to them. First of all, they become dependent on the abuser for any of their needs, particularly social needs, but also, food, clothing, hygiene, money, medication, transportation to the doctors and so forth, or church. When they're isolated, they have nobody that they can report to that something is going wrong with the relationship with the caregiver. They're fearful that if they were to leave the relationship, that they would not be able to make it on their own, recognizing again their limitations. They might feel guilty for leaving their caregiver for whatever reasons, depending upon who the caregiver is. If it's somebody they're paying, they might feel like they are leaving that caregiver and family destitute because they're no longer, providing the income that this caregiver has relied upon. They might feel guilty if it's the spouse that they pledged their, life to. If it's a parent or a child, rather, who's taking care of them, and they recognize that they have been some limitation on that child's freedom, or feel as if they've been imposing on that child, they might feel guilty about leaving and not having that relationship when the child has been so dedicated, at least from their perspective. There might be religious convictions or, again, a lack of resources. So there are multiple reasons why they stay in these abusive relationships and return to abusive relationships. We need to also be cognizant of cultural effects on the relationship between the victims and the perpetrators or caregivers. We need to understand that a history of trauma in that relationship, or even individually on behalf of the victim, is going to give that victim a different lens to view the relationship through. And they might think, I've been through a war, I can go through this. They might also think, I'm not going to put up with this after all I've accomplished. So more likely than not, they're going to be beholden to the caregiver or the perpetrator. Culture also determines how they respond to being physically abused or being financially exploited. And they will be more forgiving, perhaps, because of their culture, or they might be more accepting of responsibility, depending upon their culture. And they might not want family secrets to be told, and so they are too ashamed to seek help because of the culture that they are in. We also know, again, I mentioned earlier about transitions and how the parent now becomes dependent on the child, whereas the child has for so long been dependent on the parent. Even if they have been completely independent of one another, the parent might still feel responsible for the child, and they have a difficult time transitioning to being the one who the child is going to provide care for instead of vice versa. We know that there are strong patriarchal cultures and strong matriarchal cultures, and if a son is now taking care of a mother from a matriarchal culture, that's going to cause conflict. And also, I'm going to say stilt caregiving practices where, a son is not going to insist on his incontinent mother disrobing and changing her because it is just too offensive to their cultural norms. We have differences between goals within the family. Again, a spouse might be just determined with all of their energy to keep the dependent spouse at home and provide care for them at home, when the victim is wanting to be away from that spouse and away from the care that so-called care that they're providing. They might recognize that that spouse is doing the best that they can, but it's not enough. And they have the goal of going to a nursing home or an assisted living facility, whereas the spouse doesn't want to give up the promise that they made, or the child doesn't want to give up the promise that they made. There will be conflicts with regard to health care. If the elder wants to die on their own terms and their caregiver wants to perpetuate their life as much as possible, that's also an avenue, I guess, that would impose somebody else's decision-making on the elder and could be a form of abuse. And then quality of life as well. The elder might be suffering, and the caregiver wants to keep that person alive for as long as possible, or wants to keep them in their home for as long as possible, and believes that they're providing everything that the victim needs. But because they're not receiving the level of care that they need, and they're not enjoying the quality of life that they could be, that could also be abusive. Culture affects: A, gender roles within the family; B, conflict between the preferences of the aging adult and safeguarding the elder; C, views of quality of life; D, all of the above. Caregiver stress is real, is fake news, is a primary cause of elder abuse to occur, is never a primary cause of elder abuse. The court can help survivors of elder abuse by A, assisting the survivor with a plan for their care and safety after they separate from the abuser, or giving them money to leave. B, referring the survivor to a victim advocate or calling the abuse hotline. C, granting all protective orders sought against alleged perpetrators of elder abuse and referring them to elder law lawyers. Or D, asking them why they don't separate themselves from the abuser and then ordering them not to have any more contact. So the answer to the first question is correct, is rather D, all of the above, and just about everybody got that correct. Caregiver stress is never a primary cause of elder abuse. However, it is real. And fake news would be the part where it's blamed for elder abuse. And then 3, the court can help survivors of elder abuse by, most of you got it correct, which is referring the survivor to a victim advocate and calling the abuse hotline. So we move on then to safety planning, asking the elder what has been working to keep them safe, and asking them what stops them from leaving and what event would ultimately make you leave, and having them be more insightful about their situation, but refer them to the domestic violence advocate or another advocate, and enable them to consider seeking injunctive protection. The advocate should be asking them where they will live. This is not up to the court to ask, but if you monitor it, you should know that the advocate should be asking them where they will live, helping them make plans to go there, asking them what their source of income is or where their money is, and getting them access to their own money, making sure that they have plans for health care. They're going to stay with the same doctors that they've always had, or they're going to need new doctors, and putting them in touch with referral services, or getting referrals for them, making sure they have the medications that they're currently taking if they're leaving a situation, and prescriptions for refills, that they have the legal advice and support that they need, and that if there are other relatives or friends that are going to help keep them safe, to either enable them, and again, this is the advocate, not the court, enable them to contact those friends and relatives so that they're aware of the change of their residence and contact information, and perhaps reaching out to help the elder as well. And then providing notice to not only those friends and relatives, but also the perpetrator of the change that's being made, why it's being made, and I guess making sure that they're aware that they've been caught abusing somebody who's elderly. All right, I think we can end there then. Thank you very much for attending, and if you have any questions that you think of afterwards, please don't hesitate to submit those, and I'm sure somebody will get them to me and I'll be glad to answer.